Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. You know how this works. You bring us the topics, we do the research, and together we dive deep. The idea is to take those complex subjects that really make you think and break them down so we can all actually, understand them.
That's exactly right. We sift through the sources, we analyze the arguments, and we pull out the really crucial information so you can get the knowledge you need without feeling totally bogged down. Right.
Exactly. So today we're diving into something pretty intense, I gotta say. One of you sent in excerpts from G.Edward Griffin's book, Fearful Master, a second look at the United Nations, and, well, let's just say it's a book that doesn't shy away from controversy.
It definitely doesn't. Griffin's got some strong opinions about the UN, and he uses some very specific historical events and arguments to make his case.
Yeah, so our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack those arguments and the evidence he presents, We want to lay it all out there as clearly as possible, but also, really important point here, we got to be super impartial, especially because we're dealing with some politically charged stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We're not here to endorse or condemn any particular viewpoint. We're here to analyze, explore, and let you, the listener, draw your own conclusions.
Exactly. Okay, so where does Griffin start? Well, he jumps right in with a really specific historical case study.
Right off the bat, he focuses on the UN's intervention in Katanga.
Now, for those who might need a little refresher, Katanga was a province in the Congo that declared its independence, and Griffin portrays it as a place that actually had, some semblance of stability and order after the Congo as a whole gained independence. But things get complicated when the UN steps in.
Yeah, Griffin argues that the UN made certain promises to Katanga's leader, Moise Tshombe, especially about the use of force, promises that he claims were ultimately broken.
And that sets the stage for some pretty disturbing accounts of what happened in Katanga. Griffin brings in first-hand sources, like reports from doctors and eyewitnesses, and the picture he paints is, well, it's pretty grim.
He describes the alleged bombing of the Shinkalabwe Hospital on December 12, 1961, despite it being clearly marked with the Red Cross.
And there are some really, really harrowing details from a report by 46 civilian doctors in Elizabethville. They talk about women who had just given birth being wounded, a newborn baby injured, and the deaths of a small child who was just visiting and several men. And what's even more striking is that, according to this report, over 200 patients out of 300 actually fled the hospital because they were so terrified of further UN attacks.
It's a powerful image, and Griffin uses it to make a larger point.
Yeah.
That UN interventions, even those intended for peacekeeping, can have unintended and even devastating consequences.
And it makes you question, right? It makes you question the UN's capabilities, its motives, the whole idea of what peacekeeping actually means.
Exactly. Yeah. And to reinforce this point, Griffin brings in more first-hand accounts. He talks about an eyewitness account from Professor Ernest van den Haag, who visited the Congo and spoke with a mother whose husband was allegedly killed and her 6-year-old child wounded by UN soldiers using bayonets.
Griffin really emphasizes the point that a 6-year-old child is hardly a combatant.
Right. And he continues with another detailed account, this one involving the Derrick's family and a man named Jean Fimbo. He cites a source called 46 Angry Men, where an eyewitness, Andre Kapenga, describes seeing UN soldiers shooting and killing Mr. Fimbo, then shooting Mr. and Mrs. Derrick's.
He goes into detail about the types of weapons used, the wounds inflicted. It's all very, very graphic. And it's meant to challenge the idea that the UN is always a force for good, a force for peace.
Now, it's important to note that Griffin does acknowledge that some, like G. Menon Williams, who was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State at the time, accused the Katangese of fabricating these stories. But he counters this by quoting Smith Hempstone, an American journalist who supported the accusations.
Right. And Griffin makes it clear that his focus on Katanga isn't about glorifying Katanga or its leaders. It's about using this case study to expose what he sees as the potential dangers of surrendering national sovereignty to an organization like the UN.
So the Katanga story is really the foundation for his larger argument.
Yeah, it's the launching pad for his much broader claim about the UN, that it's been infiltrated and manipulated by communist forces.
Right, and that brings us to what he calls the master planners.
Yeah.
This is where Griffin lays out his core thesis, that there was a deliberate, long-term communist plan for world domination, and the UN was a crucial part of it.
He even cites a supposed 3-stage plan from the Communist International, starting with socializing individual nations' economies, then moving to regional unions, and ultimately leading to a global socialist state. And he argues that the UN fits perfectly into this strategy.
And he points to the Soviet Union's early and consistent support for the UN as evidence of this. He even mentions Tryggvi, the first UN Secretary General, who wrote in his book that it was actually the Soviets who pushed for the UN headquarters to be in the United States.
Which, if you think about it from Griffin's perspective, is kind of a strategic move, right? Having your quote-unquote enemy's headquarters right in your backyard.
Exactly. And from there, Griffin goes on to outline 6 specific objectives he believes the communists had for the UN.
Things like breaking up non-communist colonial territories, encouraging nations to abandon their independent foreign policies, promoting socialism as a stepping stone to communism, and ultimately transferring military control to the UN. It's a pretty comprehensive list, and it paints a very specific picture of a hidden agenda.
And to sell this idea to the American people, Griffin claims there was a deliberate propaganda campaign. He cites a directive from the communist periodical Political Affairs that emphasized the importance of the U.S. adhering to the policies that led to the creation of the UN.
And there's a statement from Earl Browder, who was the head of the Communist Party in the U.S. at the time, talking about the need to neutralize any opposition to the UN.
Griffin also brings in an observation from Connor Cruz O'Brien, a diplomat who had worked with the UN, who pointed out the significant control that the UN Secretariat, the administrative body, has over information and decision-making within the organization.
So it's like, if you control the information, you control the narrative, right?
Right. And that leads us to Griffin's next major point,
Mm.
the alleged presence and influence of communists within the UN Secretariat.
He throws out some big numbers here. He cites J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, who estimated that a large percentage of Soviet bloc diplomats stationed in the U.S. were actually involved in espionage.
And he gives specific examples of alleged abuses of diplomatic immunity by Soviet UN personnel. Things like the forced repatriation of Soviet sailors who didn't want to go back, and the case of Tanya Romanov, a woman who sought asylum in the U.S.
It's all about painting a picture of a system that's being exploited, and Griffin then goes on to name specific individuals within the UN Secretariat who he claims has communist affiliations and held key positions.
He mentions Mrs. Jugalova at UNESCO, Egorov in personnel, Permagrov in radio broadcasts, and Katsuchi on the Sixth Committee, which deals with legal matters.
And he makes a particularly striking claim about the position of Undersecretary General for Political and Security Council Affairs, saying that this crucial position, which oversees military and police functions, disarmament, atomic energy, has allegedly always been held by a communist.
So from Griffin's perspective, it's not just a few isolated individuals, it's a pattern of influence at the highest levels of the UN.
And he doesn't stop there. He goes back even further to the very creation of the UN, claiming that many of the individuals involved had communist backgrounds or affiliations.
He points to Alger Hiss, who played a significant role in the conferences leading up to the UN's establishment, and Harry Dexter White, who was influential in setting up the International Monetary Fund. He even names specific individuals within the State and Treasury departments who he says had communist ties.
And he uses sources like Adolf Berle's testimony and a memorandum from Secretary of State George Marshall to back up his claims. It's like he's building a case piece by piece to show that the UN was, from its very inception, susceptible to communist influence.
And he even brings up Trygve Lie's own words on the matter. Lie argued that the UN Charter doesn't explicitly prohibit people from working for the organization based on their political beliefs, because of the UN's diverse membership.
Which, again, from Griffin's perspective, could be seen as a loophole that allows for infiltration.
Exactly. He then moves on to talk about Senator Eastland's committee, which found a significant number of communists among U.S. citizens working at the UN, and the case of Ralph Bunche, a prominent American diplomat whose loyalty was questioned.
And there's a quote from Adlai Stevenson, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, about communist regimes being eager to join the UN, which Griffin presents as somewhat ironic, given his claims about the anti-American sentiment within the organization.
And finally, Griffin looks at the backgrounds of the first 3 UN Secretaries General. He suggests that Tryggvi Lie was perhaps naive about communism, that Dag Hammarskjöld has socialist leanings, and that U Thant had a history with a left-leaning political group in Burma.
It's like he's trying to show a pattern, right? A pattern of individuals with questionable loyalties or ideologies holding positions of power within the UN.
Exactly. So we've got this historical backdrop, these allegations of communist influence, and now Griffin shifts gears to what he calls psychological warfare.
Yeah, this is where things get really interesting because he's talking about how the UN and specifically UNESCO were actively involved in shaping American thought and undermining traditional American values.
He quotes Representative Lawrence H. Smith, who in 1955 called the UN a trap and UNESCO a peril to the United States.
Strong words, right. And Griffin then points out that both the State Department and President Truman basically dismissed criticisms of UNESCO.
Which he sees as further evidence that something fishy is going on.
Right. So what exactly does Griffin believe UNESCO is trying to do? Well, he outlines four main objectives: weakening patriotism, instilling a sense of internationalism, promoting a form of Marxian socialism, and neutralizing the influence of traditional religious and moral beliefs.
He even includes a quote from Joseph Z. Kornfetter, a former communist who became an anti-communist activist, who basically compared UNESCO to the Communist Party's propaganda department.
So, in Griffin's view, UNESCO was essentially a tool for brainwashing Americans.
And he connects the dots back to his earlier claims about communist influence, pointing to the involvement of Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White, and others in UNESCO's founding. He also mentions the concerns raised by the Senate Committee on the Judiciary about possible subversion within UNESCO.
There's even a quote from Dr. Luther Evans, a former Director General of UNESCO, who said that the U.S. campaign against communist infiltration was threatening the organization.
Which Griffin interprets as confirmation that the U.S. was onto something.
And then he talks about this idea of using well-intentioned but naive idealists to advance communist goals within the UN. The idea being that many people who genuinely believed in international cooperation were being unknowingly manipulated.
He also claims that UNESCO's literature was based on atheistic and materialistic principles, and that it aimed to weaken the influence of families on children. He cites specific UNESCO publications and quotes to support this.
He even gives examples from reading for understanding tests used in U.S. schools, arguing that some of the questions were designed to undermine traditional values related to things like church attendance, the role of science, nationalism, and conservatism.
And he points to instances where he sees the promotion of UN Day over traditional American holidays as part of this broader effort to shift allegiances away from national identity and towards a global one.
He talks about the impact on American youth, roughing up the experiences of prisoners of war during the Korean War, and a statement from General David M. Shoup about a perceived decline in understanding American values. He also mentions UNESCO's involvement in the Cuban education system after the revolution.
And he expresses concerns about a proposed UNESCO treaty against discrimination in education, suggesting it could lead to international control over American schools.
And finally, in this section on psychological warfare, Griffin claims that the mass media suppressed dissenting voices regarding the UN. He contrasts the generally positive coverage with the critical views held by figures like former President Herbert Hoover and Senator Robert Taft, whose opinions were largely ignored.
He mentioned Adlai Stevenson asking journalists to portray the UN favorably, and the alleged experience of a news commentator, George Tott, who was supposedly taken off the air for criticizing the UN. He also talks about extensive positive media coverage and the use of children in promoting UN initiatives like UNICEF's Trick or Treat.
He even brings up Superman promoting the World Health Organization in comic books. It's like he's saying that this psychological warfare was happening on multiple fronts, from the classroom to the living room.
So, having presented his historical analysis, his claims about communist influence, and his theory of psychological warfare, Griffin moves towards his conclusion, which he calls the fearful master, the present reality, and imminent danger.
And this is where he really cranks up the intensity. He's arguing that the UN has become a dangerous force, a threat to American sovereignty and freedom.
He starts by using the Korean War as a prime example of how the UN, in his view, prevented a decisive victory and instead imposed terms that benefited the communists. He talks about the ceasefire line, the ports of entry, the presence of Chinese troops in North Korea, and the role of neutral nations, including communist countries, in supervising the armistice.
He even claims that the Korean War was essentially directed by communists, mentioning a General Vasilev on the UN Military Staff Committee and his replacement, both of whom he says were communists.
He then goes on to list what he sees as the negative consequences of the Korean War: the strengthening of communist China, the distraction of the American public, and the UN's treatment of the aggressor and the victim as equals. He also mentions President Eisenhower discouraging South Korea from liberating the North, and the issue of unaccounted for American prisoners of war, criticizing the UN's inaction.
And he accuses the UN of applying a double standard, condemning anti-communist South Africa while ignoring communist aggression in other places.
He also takes issue with the composition of the UN World Court, noting the presence of justices from leftist or communist countries, and he critiques the U.S. representative at the time, Philip Jessup.
Then he moves on to a broader discussion about the potential dangers of international treaties, quoting John Foster Dulles, who warned that the treaty-making power could override the U.S. Constitution.
He discusses Supreme Court rulings that expanded the scope of treaty supremacy and the defeat of the Bricker Amendment, which sought to limit that power.
He then raises concerns about the UN's World Health Organization, suggesting that it promotes unlimited government interference, and he criticizes UN economic development funds, arguing that they place an unfair burden on the U.S.
He highlights the increasing authority of the UN General Assembly over the Security Council, where the U.S. and other permanent members have veto power. He points to the Uniting for Peace resolution as a way to bypass that veto.
And then he gets to the issue of disarmament, which he sees as a major threat. He links it to stated communist goals and quotes Khrushchev and other communist leaders to make his point. He discusses the creation of the UN Atomic Energy Agency and his concerns about communist influence within it.
He mentioned the U.S. proposal for complete disarmament presented to the UN and a statement by Adlai Stevenson about eliminating national war-making capabilities. He talks about the Arms Control and Disarmament Agency and its powers, and he sees the Moscow Test Ban Treaty as a step towards giving the UN control over nuclear weapons.
And he ends this section with a chilling warning. If the UN gains full control of the U.S. military, there will be more Katangas, possibly even on U.S. soil.
So it's a pretty bleak picture he paints.
Yeah, definitely. And that leads us to his section titled Point of No Return Disarmament. He compares America's rush towards internationalism and disarmament to lemmings running off a cliff.
He challenges the idea that arming leads to war, pointing to Pearl Harbor and Korea as examples where the opposite was true. He argues that disarmament actually invites aggression, and that communist support for disarmament is aimed at weakening capitalist nations.
And he summarizes what he sees as the key steps towards U.S. disarmament.
Yeah.
The formal proposal, the Arms Control and Disarmament Act, and the Moscow Test Ban Treaty.
Then he tackles head-on the populars, saying the UN is our last best hope for peace.
He makes a distinction between peace with freedom and the mere absence of war, arguing that you can have peace without freedom, but it's not real peace. He uses the example of communist forced labor camps to illustrate this point.
He also questions whether an organization that includes countries with such different ideologies can actually achieve true peace. He quotes Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, Jr., who said, "I will not sit side by side with both the virtuous and the criminal."
And he points out that talking doesn't always prevent war, using the example of Pearl Harbor, which happened while the U.S. was engaged in diplomatic talks with Japan.
He also dismantles the analogy between the UN and the Federation of the 13 Colonies, arguing that the American Civil War proves that federations don't always prevent conflict.
Then he addresses the label of isolationism that's often applied to critics of the UN. He argues that the U.S. has always been engaged in world affairs and that true isolationism has never been a real policy.
He criticizes a Gallup poll question that equated working with other nations with abandoning independence, suggesting that this framing was misleading. He also points out the contradiction in the argument that the U.S. is both strong enough to support the world financially and too weak to survive on its own.
So what does Griffin propose as an alternative to the UN? Well, he lays it all out in his final section, A Path Forward.
He starts with a call for renewed patriotism, a return to traditional American values, and a strengthening of the American spirit.
He advocates for a shift away from financing socialism and towards promoting free enterprise around the world.
He calls for the removal of individuals in the U.S. government whom he views as disloyal or having questionable allegiances.
He urges a decisive move towards victory over communism rather than mere coexistence.
He suggests reducing government regulations and restrictions within the U.S. to increase personal freedom.
He emphasizes the importance of mutual respect and goodwill in international relations and prioritizing private investment over foreign aid.
He reaffirms the concept of the U.S. as a limited republic with constraints on government power.
He invokes George Washington's warning against foreign entanglements.
And he draws a parallel between the grievances listed in the Declaration of Independence and what he sees as the tyranny of the UN and an expanding federal government.
So there you have it. That's G.Edward Griffin's perspective on the UN, as laid out in his book Fearful Master. He presents a pretty stark and unsettling view of the organization, its history, and its potential impact on American sovereignty and freedom.
And while his arguments are certainly controversial and thought-provoking, we've tried to present them as objectively as possible, allowing you, the listener, to weigh the evidence and reach your own conclusions.
But here's a final thought to consider. If Griffin's analysis is even partially accurate, What does that mean for the future of international cooperation? Can we find ways to work together on a global scale without compromising our own values and interests? That's the real challenge, and it's one that we all need to grapple with as we move forward in an increasingly interconnected world.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. It's been quite a journey.
Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.
And let us know what you'd like us to dive into next.
We'll see you then.